Mark McLean. I just want to ask a few questions just around dissent within both the Unionist and the Nationalist tradition, which sometimes I think gets glossed over in these histories of the period. First of all, I don't know where anybody has done it, but whether there's been any research on what percentage of Protestants in Ulster would have signed the Covenant and whether the response rate differed anyway differently, across the province. And on the Protestant Home Rule Covenant, could that be described as sort of the dying throes of sort of a dissenting liberal Presbyterian tradition in North Antrim particularly? And just following on from that, there was a number of individuals who, opposed unionism and nationalism, the established parties. I'm thinking of Thomas Sloan, Horace Plunkett in South Dublin, T.W. Russell in South Tyrone, and on the nationalist side you had O'Brien, the All for Ireland League, and Timothy Healy. What impact did those individuals have on the Irish Party and the Ulster Unionist movement, and how did those parties sort of counteract those potential threats?
So really, why had unionism become such a major force in the early 20th century, countering the sort of land reformers, the Russellites, the independent Orangemen, and those kind of dissenting elements? Would you like to?
I'll pick up on your first point, which was kind of, I think you mentioned about we can never be precise about what kind of percentage of Protestants actually signed the Covenant. I think as you mentioned that at the very beginning. It's very difficult to estimate because if you think about it, people who were able to sign the Covenant had to be in those days over the age of 21. The population covered in this period of time was probably in the region of 1 to 1.5 million or thereabouts. But they reckoned that 70 to 80% at least of the Protestant population in the 9 counties, and this is a very crude estimate, were actually prepared to sign. Now that asks what happened to the other 20-25%. I think some of that was because they were indisposed or unwilling or apathetic. And then there was the group that Eamon talked about, a relatively small number who were fundamentally opposed to it.
Go on.
Right. In a sense, yes, the Unionist parties fraying at the edges in the first decade of the 20th century with the attack from T.W. Russell and his desire for compulsory land purchase, and T.H. Sloan. But those people all really disappear like snow of a ditch when Home Rule becomes the central issue in politics. Mm-hmm. It's perfectly possible to live in North Fermanagh or South Tyrone or East Down, seats which were all represented by Russellite MPs, as long as Home Rule. If you're a unionist and you're a tenant farmer and you want compulsory purchase, it's perfectly possible to vote for a Russellite candidate, as people did in all those 3 constituencies. Mm. But once the threat of Home Rule reasserts itself, that no longer is easy or simple. To take the North Belfast seat, North Belfast is contested on 3 occasions by William Walker. William Walker contests the seat at a by-election in 1905, the general election of January 1906, and a by-election in 1907. In 1905, William Walker has a Labour unionist, a Labour man who believes in the union, unlike James Connolly, and he polls very strongly in 1905, polls very strongly, even more strongly in 1906. But by 1907, when you've got a Liberal government and the prospect of Home Rule, he is opposed by Sir George Clark of Workman Clark Shipbuilders, and he decisively beats him. Sort of up until 1907, it looked as if North Belfast was a marginal, and it was only a matter of time before it would fall into Labour hands. But once you have the centrality of the Home Rule issue, Protestant or Unionist opinion rallies in behind the Unionist Party. Sloan comes a cropper in the general election of January 1910. The reason for that is in the light of the Macklemore Manifesto, people no longer are absolutely sure whether Sloane is for the Union or against the Union. And indeed, he lives in Tigers Bay, and people are actually stoning his house. His neighbours in Tigers Bay are not confident that this man is solid or sound for the Union. So the Home Rule issue polarises opinion in Ulster and brings people fairly decisively behind the Unionist Party.
And a key factor in that is the rise of the Ulster Unionist Council in 1905, because it is the response of the Craigs, James Craig, Charles Craig, other sort of middle-class unionists elbowing out the gentry. They still have their place, but the Saundersons and the Brookes are no longer preeminent in unionism. It's a more democratic organisation reflecting the various social classes. It's much more Ulster-centred as well. You have this Ulster-centric focus of the Ulster Unionist Council. I mean, some people see it as a kind of a prototype of the first Northern Ireland Parliament, but it brings together unionist associations, Orange Lodges, MPs, peers, and they're focusing on the North for the first time. Okay, it's the 9-county province, but the reason why Craig is so keen to structure this at that time is because of the challenges from, if you like, the independent Orange men who are stressing the labour issue. That's what gives Thomas Sloane from Sandy Row his seat in South Belfast. That's what leads to that 1905-6 alliance, you know, the Sloane-Devlin-Walker Pact, where Devlin, the Home Ruler, has an unwritten agreement with Sloane, the independent Protestant, and Walker, the Labour man in North Belfast. 2 of them were elected out of 4 seats, the biggest challenge to official unionism until very recent years. And you can see the risks. Somebody like Craig returned from the Boer War, strongly Orange, aware of the real dangers of a liberal Home Rule alliance in the near future, is determined to, you know, bring unionism back to basics and to kind of, if you like, transcend the differences that are arising between class and all of that kind of thing. Now, out of that come certain long-term minority movements. I mean, Robert Lindsay Crawford, who's very much the ideologue of the independent Orange Order. He writes the Maharamore Manifesto that condemns Dublin Castle rule, you know, in 1902, 03, and actually calls for a brotherhood of Irishmen. It's seen as a kind of a home rule document. What does he end up? He ends up a journalist in Toronto, supporting Sinn Féin, and the Irish Free State's first representative in New York in 1922. He started off as the editor of the Irish Protestant newspaper and an Orangeman. So there are people like that who follow their kind of free-thinking ways. The other thing is, who didn't sign the Covenant? Some interesting groups of people. Yes, you have the Protestant Home Rulers. I mean, to Armour of Ballymoney, who held sway in the route, who was descended from Presbyterian United Irishmen in 1798, who had watched an eviction scene at his cottage door in the year of famine, 1847. And from that moment, he said, he was imbued with a hatred of landlordism and wanted to drive a nail into that evil system which turned a tenant farmer and his family on the road in the snow. And you have that radical thing in Armour. That's quite significant. He called the Covenant Ulster Day, Protestant Fool's Day. He mocked it. He said it was hardly observed in Ballymoney at all. So they didn't sign the Covenant. Neither did the Covenanters, the real sort of Presbyterian, Reformed Presbyterians of North Armagh, Market Hill. I remember doing a study there and finding that pupils in a local controlled secondary school couldn't understand why their ancestors' names weren't in the Covenant. Didn't sign the Covenant because they were Covenanters. They took no part in politics, the things of Caesar. They didn't vote and they didn't sign.
Question for Dr. Patterson. I mean, I was surprised to hear that Lord Perry, a very important Protestant capitalist in the northeast of Ireland, was pro-Home Rule. Were there other Protestant capitalists in the northeast of Ireland who were equally supportive of Home Rule? And secondly, when it comes to the extraordinary support that came from the British establishment, was that motivated by more from a point of view of a defence of Protestant heritage, or for an interest in the defending of economic investment that British capitalists might have had in the north?
Well, to take the second one, I think to be fair, I'm not just talking about the Tory party. I'm talking about the aristocracy. I think their attitudes towards Ulster were pretty genuine, actually. They rightly or wrongly saw the Protestant community in Ulster as being endangered, as being the kind of religious minority in Ireland that were under threat the most. And I think a lot of their response was genuine. I think as far as the Tories were concerned, I would say that in many ways it was political pragmatism, just as it was with the Liberals and the Irish Nationalists. There was also political pragmatism as far as the Tories were concerned, and they used the whole thing about the Unionists in Ulster to their own advantage. And it's quite interesting. Leo Amery, who became a subsequent Privy Councillor and a leading Unionist, actually wrote later on, I think it was late 1914, when he actually admitted that the party had actually, in a sense, used the situation to their own advantage. To answer the first part of your question, which was, you were talking about Perry. I mean, Eamon might be able to enlighten us on this one, but Perry was a bit of an enigma. I mentioned Willoughby the Broke has been very much an enigma, but Perry was also an enigma. I mean, people churn this out, oh, Perry was he was a Protestant, but he was also a Home Ruler. But I mean, Perry actually, in many ways, turned towards the Home Rule Party because he had been rejected as a candidate. Was it South Belfast? I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, Perry's family, trying to do some research on him, as I have done over the years, it's been very difficult because, as some of you may know, if you're Titanic buffs, he was very, very reluctant to share his family's secrets, his family, even the business, even Harland and Wolff, the way it was run. He was very reluctant to be open about that, and I'm not sure about his political position, whether that was basically sour grapes. You can actually say, was it sour grapes that made him turn from being somebody who was not only backing the union, but actually wanted to stand for, as a unionist member of representative in Parliament, to somebody who was diametrically opposed to it. But I mean, he was, and I think Gordon mentioned Workman Clark. There was an interesting contrast between Perry, who was, his approach was, if Catholic workers were expelled from the shipyards, there were threats went out, as they were, some of them, intimidated from the shipyards. Threats went out from the management that unless this activity stopped, that men caught doing it would actually be sacked. And that actually contrasted quite sharply with Workman Clark, who, I don't know if you know, the Workman Clark yard was the wee yard, as it was called, until it went out of business in the late 1920s. And Workman Clark was a very, very strong unionist. You know, and in many ways, he was involved in the gun. Not him personally, but his lieutenants were involved in the gun running of April 1914. Yeah, he was. There you are. Yeah. So you know, there were others, and I think Eamon's touched on some of them. You had clerics like Armour up in Antrim, and Jeremiah.
Jeremiah Jordan.
Yeah,
he wasn't a cleric.
He was a member of Parliament for Clare, was it?
South Fermanagh in the end.
South Fermanagh, but he was.
You have a range of people. I mean, really, if you look at that pamphlet, you can see about 150 Northern Protestants, all people of stamp, like Sir Samuel Keatley on the Stranmillis Road in Mount Pleasant, who was a writer, who had been a Liberal candidate in various elections, who was a lawyer, who was prominent in the Queen's Senate. You had people like R.G. Glendinning, who owned a linen manufactory in Murray Street. In fact, some of our friends in the Community Relations Council work in his offices. He was the last Liberal Home Rule MP for North Antrim. He was a Home Ruler who represented North Antrim until 1910, very much backed by Armour. You had John Pinkerton, from Ballymoney, who was the nationalist MP for Galway. You had Jeremiah Jordan in Enniskillen, a Methodist lay preacher, extensive businessman, who sat for 3 Irish counties, West Clare, South Meath, and then eventually South Fermanagh. All of them were very, very clear that they had no fear of Catholic persecution under Home Rule. Now, Perry had been a very enlightened Unionist Lord Mayor of Belfast in the 1890s. His wife seemed to come from a very, very strong Liberal family. There certainly may have been a sense of being jilted by the Tory establishment. But certainly after 1906, he hoisted his colours firmly to the Liberal mass to such an extent that in 1912, when sectarian violence broke out in the shipyard, and he found himself and his wife being mobbed at places like Larne as they got on steamers, he threatened to remove Belfast shipyard to Dublin and actually reconnoitred a site at the North Wall and said, I will take all this away if I have to, because I can do this. And certainly from 1906, he's not really part of the Unionist establishment at all. Quite friendly with people like Redmond and Devlin. And there are many others. Sir Hugh Mack, who was a linen manufacturer in Lisburn. Many of these strong farmers. And, you know, in places like The Root and Moneyrea in North Down, where there was a liberal tradition going back to the 1880s, where 200 people said they had Irish in the 1911 census, you find non-subscribing Presbyterians who had been members of the Gaelic League, because in that little island of Moneyrea, there was a home rule sense right down to at least 1918.